Thanks for taking the time to download this BBC Radio 5 Live podcast. To search for other podcasts you might like, click bbc.co.uk/5live, where you'll also find our terms of use.
Exactly. Secure communications over the internet have been paramount lately when it comes to both connecting and protecting people. Online groups associated with uprisings in Libya, Syria and further afield have been a focus point for organisations like Tor and Telecomics. Another plan currently in development is to address social activity on the internet, and the people involved hope to grow their network from the individual out rather than planning a preset ecosystem for people to set up inside. Heather Marsh is the spokesperson for Global Square Project, and we chatted about how it should work.
Global Square is a new environment for social and organizational communication. There's a new system of IDs and profiles for your individual security. And from there, we will go up to create communication between individual profiles, and from there, tools for people to work together and organize together, and eventually creating systems such as the News Commons and the global market where people will work and organize their lives and their governance. So from the cellular structure all the way up, we're starting with the user profiles first of all.
To try and visualise what we're talking about here, is this sort of a matter of, say, building something akin to a social media profile, but under secure conditions, and then to be able to connect from there?
Yes, it's starting with the individual instead of the system. So instead of building a Facebook system, we start with the actual individual. For me, what's happened to the internet is exactly like what's happened to our democracy in general. In democracy, that very, very poorly defined term, and nobody can quite agree what it means. One thing most people do agree is that there will be a certain segment of the population that will be able to participate en masse in their own governance, right, as individuals. And what happened in reality is that was deemed not functional. People had work to do and they couldn't travel, and it was too awkward to have everybody participating in everything. So we ended up with this black box governance system where nobody's quite certain what happens in it, and the individual voices aren't happening at all. And the reason that democracy was so exciting all over the world was the individual participations and the individual power. And to me, the internet is the perfect symbol for that. It's exactly the same thing that's happened there. You know, anybody that's ever sat in front of a dumb terminal waiting for the mainframe to decide that you could have the resources or the data that you needed to perform your job, it was so frustrating. And when the internet first appeared, or it was first conceived, it was so exciting, because you were going to have all that autonomous control. You were going to be able to do everything all by yourself. You were going to have control over your own environment, but you could still communicate with everybody. If you had a big project to work on, you could share resources. The internet, the reason it was so exciting is because it really was democracy. It was the exact same concept, and the exact same thing has happened to it. People have said, well, it's much more convenient if we go through these servers, and if we give all this control over to these external parties, it'll be so much more efficient. Exactly like they did with democracy. And people, as they always do, if someone says they're going to take care of you and do all the hard work for you, we're all for it, right? And the exact same thing has happened. Now we're finding our communications are completely controlled. Our data is not our own. It's a perfect symbol for what's happened in real life, what's happened online. So we want to get that part right first. We want to work in a peer-to-peer environment where we start with individual security and individual power first.
In which case, if you're making the individual look after themselves to a certain extent, is it a hard sell to make people do this? Because, I mean, they could try and access, dark web or try and navigate the internet in ways that are not maybe as user-friendly, but mean that you have a bit more control. But it's seen as being very difficult.
That's why we're working with Tribler from TU Delft. They are what they call a fourth-generation peer-to-peer tool, and they're very advanced. They're a beautiful system. They have a beautiful interface. They're fast. Their spam control is much better than anything we've seen before. They work on a sort of a Reddit model where channels are voted up or voted down depending on the user feedback, so the spam disappears off the bottom. It's a beautiful system. We think it is very user-friendly. We think it's going to be as easy for people to use as it would be for them to use Twitter and all the rest of it, but without the loss of control. So we feel that it's what we always wanted, it's what the internet was always supposed to be, and we're at the point now where there's no excuse to not have it.
Now, the main problem, obviously, when it comes to designing a system like this is that the good comes with the bad along the way. Now, you're hoping that a system like this would work so that people who are interested in good things can communicate and also look after themselves. But if a system like this, decentralised, is out there and it is harder to censor or to stop, that also means it's quite hard to stop things like child pornography, abusive imagery, anything which may be harmful to a society. So how would you manage that kind of material?
I would disagree completely with the premise. First of all, I don't believe it's harder to stop. I believe it's much easier to stop. Because if you look at the way we're doing it right now, where, the whole entire governments of, for instance, Australia and New Zealand have these giant firewalls that prevent anybody from accessing anything that the government decides they don't want them to access, which included sites like ones that were printing WikiLeaks cables and everything back last year, nothing to do with child pornography, most of them. But if you have the government doing something like that for you, acting as a parental figure and trying to find all the sites that might possibly be offensive, the government is a very few people. The people who are really combating child pornography on the internet are anonymous. They are legion. They're everywhere. If anybody can find child pornography in a peer-to-peer network or on the internet or anywhere else, then everybody can find child pornography. And those who want to shut it down, as in anonymous, and right-thinking people, which there are far more right-thinking people than there are people who want to look at child pornography, will shut it down and will do a much better job of it than the government ever could. And that was, again, the original concept of the internet. Parental controls were originally put to be implemented by the users themselves. They were not supposed to come from some centralized authority originally. And that's what we would like to go back to, because no government can ever do the job that we could do ourselves.
The example there with child pornography is an extreme end, and hopefully right-thinking people, as you say, the majority of people would not agree with that kind of material being spread. But there's also the chance that a government or an authority may disagree with something that most people think is okay, but they might wish to block this. How does Global Square circumvent this if it's running on telecoms? Because obviously, say here in the UK, telecoms companies can find ways to stop you using the internet, so it can be blocked at that level. Does Global Square work around this?
Well, that will be a confrontation that we expect to have one day, probably sooner than later. And, they control your broadband, they control your access, they do. And as Johan, the director of the Tribler project, has said, the only way to shut it down is to shut down the internet. And I expect that confrontation probably will happen. But, what you're coming out to then is if all of the people agree that this is a good idea and the government says it isn't, we have a slight problem with the governance then, don't we?
When would people be able to try and make their identity to then start to progress from there?
The end of March is our goal. We are a part of the Berlin exposition at the Biennale. It starts on April 27th, and we need to have something up and running by then. So it's a short time frame. And at that point, it would be the cells swimming in the ocean, being able to communicate with each other and have their own little space. But it would progress very quickly from there, I think.
Are you still also looking for people who can work on this? Because there's some technical skills required to try and make this work, and maybe many hands will make lighter work. Are you still calling out for coders to help?
Absolutely. And we're working with an awful lot of people. There are a lot of people who have seen in the last year everything that's wrong with the system. The way the internet has been going since the beginning has been problematic for a lot of us. But, in the last year, exactly last year, in February, as I'm sure you remember being in the media, what it was like when all of the footage was coming out from the Day of Rages, the Domino Day of Rages, and people were risking their lives to get YouTube footage, and they would put it up on YouTube and it would be down 20 minutes later because somebody would have reported it as offensive content. And people have really realized since that time that we need alternatives and we need them urgently. So there have been a lot of people working on a lot of different projects, and we are all getting together and talking. And there's a big, big organizational task ahead of us, yes.
All right, then, if we'd like to either offer skills or come and take a look, where can we best find you online to find out more?
globalsquare.org.